The dust rose in choking clouds across the burned fields, mingling with the acrid scent of gunpowder and blood. The battlefield stretched for miles, littered with broken armor, twisted metal, and the hollow stares of men who would never rise again. In the chaos, amid the crack of rifles and the thunder of mortars, she stood, small compared to the hulking men around her, her arms wiry instead of thick, her body lean where others were broad. They had mocked her since the day she joined, their laughter sharp as knives. She won't even carry her own pack, they'd sneered. How's she going to carry a wounded man? Her arms, thin but scarred with the calluses of work, had become a joke in the barracks, a running theme during drills, whispered and laughed about when they thought she couldn't hear. But she heard, every word, every laugh, every bite of cruelty disguised as humor. And though she never replied, though her lips stayed pressed in silence, her heart absorbed it all like dry ground drinking storm water. The morning had broken with the sound of artillery. Their unit had marched at dawn into the firestorm, and by mid-afternoon the line had splintered. Screams tore the air, shells burst, the wounded cried out for mothers, for lovers, for anyone who could reach them. She had been pinned behind a shattered wall, her rifle clutched in trembling hands, sweat trickling down her spine beneath the heavy uniform. Every time she leaned out to fire, the recoil rattled her bones, but she did it anyway, teeth clenched, firing until her vision blurred. Then she saw him, a man down across the open ground, bleeding heavily from his leg. He was one of the ones who had laughed the hardest at her arms, one of the loudest in the barracks when they mocked her inability to carry the heavy water barrels. He was crawling, dragging himself with one arm, leaving a dark red trail in the mud. Each movement was weaker than the last, his eyes wild with terror as bullets kicked up soil around him. And in that instant, as she locked eyes with him across the chaos, something broke loose inside her. Her comrades shouted at her to stay down, to forget him, that the field was too open. But her ears had gone deaf to everything except the gasping sound of his breath as he struggled. She vaulted over the rubble, legs pounding, her lungs screaming for air as she sprinted across the killing field. The crack of rifles surrounded her, and one bullet grazed her sleeve, burning her skin, but she didn't stop. She reached him, slid into the dirt beside him, grabbing his arm. His face was pale, his lips trembling. "Leave me," he rasped. "You can't." But she ignored him, shoving his protests away with the same determination that had carried her through every insult. She slung his arm over her shoulder and hauled upward. He was heavier than she had imagined, his body like lead, his blood soaking into her sleeve. Her knees nearly buckled, her arms screamed, but she forced her legs to move. One step, then another. The field stretched endless in front of her. Each step was agony, her back straining, her teeth grinding as she dragged him through mud and blood. He kept muttering, cursing her weakness, telling her she would never make it. But the more he doubted, the harder she pulled. Her boots sank into the earth, the weight dragging her shoulders nearly out of their sockets, yet she refused to stop. Behind her, the roar of battle grew louder, closer. Shrapnel whistled past, chunks of dirt and stone rained down, but she bowed her head and pressed forward. Sweat blinded her eyes, her lungs burned raw, and her legs trembled like brittle sticks ready to snap. She could hear the voices of her comrades shouting, some in disbelief, some in mockery, some in desperate encouragement. And among them, though she couldn't see him, the general himself had turned his gaze upon the battlefield. His eyes followed the girl with the weak arms, the one they had all laughed at, as she dragged a man twice her size through death's shadow with nothing but raw defiance and unbroken will. Her mind emptied of everything except movement. Her muscles screamed, her chest heaved, but she didn't allow herself to think of failure. She thought of every laugh, every sneer, every night she had sat on her cot staring at her hands, wondering if they would ever be enough. And in that furnace of memory, a fire burned brighter than the battlefield around her. With each dragging step, she rewrote the truth they had branded her with. She was not weak. She was not fragile. She was not lesser. The weight across her shoulders was proof, the man bleeding on her arm was proof, the blood mixing with her sweat was proof. And though every fiber in her body begged her to fall, though her vision blurred with exhaustion and pain, she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her collapse. Her body ached like it was being torn apart by invisible claws, every muscle stretched beyond its limit, but still she dragged him forward through the mud, inch by inch, step by agonizing step. His blood seeped faster now, hot and sticky against her uniform, yet she refused to let him slip from her grasp. The battlefield was merciless, a place where the weak were swallowed without pity, and all around her men cried, shouted, and fell, their lives extinguished in sudden bursts of violence. She could hear the shriek of artillery above, the rattle of machine guns spitting fire into the torn earth, and the thunder of boots as soldiers shifted their positions. But for her, the world had narrowed into a single purpose: to drag this man back no matter what it cost her. His weight threatened to crush her shoulders, her knees buckled with every other step, but she clenched her jaw and growled out loud, forcing her body forward with sheer willpower. She thought of nothing else, not even the bullets slicing the air, because surrender was no longer an option. The man on her shoulder had stopped cursing now. His voice was faint, ragged, almost gone. His breath came in wet rattles, the sound of lungs filling with blood, and each time she heard it she felt an icy hand grip her chest. If she faltered now, if she allowed him to fall, he would die within minutes. She did not care that he had mocked her, that he had sneered at her arms and called her useless. In this moment he was no longer her tormentor. He was simply a man bleeding out, a human life that only she could save. And in some strange, unspoken way she knew that if she saved him, she was saving more than just his life. She was saving her own worth, proving it to herself as much as to anyone else. Her boots slipped in the wet soil, her back screamed with pain, and still she leaned forward, refusing to collapse. The ground seemed endless, a cruel stretch of mud and bodies and fire, yet she continued dragging him, teeth gritted so hard she thought they might crack. Then came the whistle of a shell, louder, closer, the shriek that meant death was seconds away. She froze for an instant, her instincts screaming at her to dive for cover, but there was nowhere to go. She tightened her grip on the man and threw herself forward with all the strength she had left. The explosion behind her ripped the earth apart, a wall of heat and force blasting into her back, hurling her onto the ground. Her ears rang with deafening silence, the world spinning in a blur of dust and fire. For a moment, she lay sprawled, half buried in dirt, her vision fogged, her arms trembling uncontrollably. The weight of the man pressed down on her, nearly crushing her chest, and for a heartbeat she thought she was done, that her body had finally reached its breaking point. But then the thought of all those faces in the barracks, the jeers, the laughter, the whispers of weakness, they flared inside her mind like sparks on dry tinder. No, she would not give them this. She would not end here. With a guttural cry, she shoved the dirt aside and rolled onto her knees, dragging the man with her. Her lungs were raw, her throat burning as if she had swallowed fire, but she forced her legs beneath her, staggered up, and continued pulling him forward. The battlefield roared again into focus, rifles cracking, men shouting, the whistle of bullets as they tore past her. But she no longer moved with fear, she moved with a kind of mad determination that blinded her to everything else. Step by step, she dragged him closer to the line where their unit had regrouped. She could see the vague shapes of her comrades ahead, waving her in, shouting her name, their voices filled with disbelief and urgency. Still, the distance between them felt like miles, an endless torment, and every step was a war against her own collapsing body. Her arms were numb now, her shoulders raw from carrying his dead weight, but numbness was better than pain. It meant she no longer cared what her body screamed at her. The man groaned again, weak and broken, his head lolling against her shoulder. His eyes fluttered open, just barely, and for the first time his gaze held something other than mockery. It was fear, yes, but also a kind of desperate trust, an understanding that she was the only thing keeping him alive. That look fueled her more than anything. She staggered, fell to one knee, nearly collapsed, but she drove herself up again with a roar that startled even herself. She did not notice the general watching from the ridge, binoculars pressed to his eyes, his jaw tightening as he saw the girl they had all dismissed dragging a full-grown soldier through the maw of death. He saw her fall, rise and fall again and still never let go. He saw the dirt and blood smeared across her face, the trembling limbs, the way her body bent under the impossible weight but refused to surrender. And in that moment, something in the general's heart shifted. He had led men for decades, seen courage in many forms, but what he saw in her burned with a rare, undeniable fire. By the time she reached the edge of their position, her body was little more than broken flesh held together by stubborn will. She stumbled into the cover of sandbags and outstretched arms reached for the wounded man, pulling him from her shoulders. The weight lifted, but she did not collapse immediately. Instead she stood there swaying, her chest heaving, her eyes blazing with something unbroken. Her arms, those same arms that had been mocked and ridiculed, hung limp at her sides, covered in blood and mud, yet they had carried the impossible. And though she could barely hear, barely see, she was dimly aware of the stunned silence around her as soldiers gaped, as whispers spread, as disbelief turned to something else. Respect. Her knees finally buckled the moment the weight was gone, and she crumpled to the dirt, coughing, her lungs tearing for air that wouldn't come. The taste of iron filled her mouth, Her chest felt like it had been crushed beneath a stone, yet somewhere inside she still held onto a flicker of defiance that refused to extinguish. Hands reached for her, but she shook them off, dragging herself upright even as her body screamed. The man she had carried was already being treated, medics swarming around him with bandages, their shouts overlapping as they tried to stop the bleeding. She watched them for only a moment, then dragged her gaze away, unwilling to look for gratitude in the eyes of someone who had spent months spitting doubt at her. She did not need his thanks. She needed only to prove to herself that she had done what others swore she could not. The air reeked of smoke and cordite, and though she was within the relative safety of their trench line, the war thundered all around. Bullets still whipped overhead, mortars still screamed, and men still shouted as they fired back into the haze. She reached for her rifle, her hands trembling so badly she almost dropped it, but her fingers clenched hard enough to steady the grip. No one said anything to her at first. They simply stared, stunned into silence, watching the woman they had mocked again and again stand back on her feet as though she were carved from something unbreakable. The silence pressed heavier than any insult, heavier than any laugh, because for once it was filled not with contempt but with the weight of recognition. She had done the unthinkable. She had stepped where none of them dared, and they knew it. Then the general's boots hit the ground. He had descended from the ridge, his greatcoat brushing the mud, his presence commanding even amid the chaos. The men straightened instinctively, but his eyes were fixed on her. She felt the weight of his gaze as if it were another burden pressing her down, but she did not flinch, did not look away. He stopped before her, silent for a moment, the battlefield echoing around them. His expression was unreadable, hard as stone, but his eyes burned with something that made her heart lurch. Respect, yes, but also curiosity, as though he were seeing her for the first time. He gave a small nod, barely perceptible to anyone else, but to her it was thunderous. Then he spoke, his voice low, steady, but carrying enough power to cut through the cacophony. "You've done more here than men twice your size." The words sank into her like heat into frozen skin. 4 months she had been invisible, the subject of ridicule, dismissed as weak, unworthy of uniform and rifle. But now, before the eyes of the very general who commanded them all, she had been acknowledged. A simple sentence, no embellishment, no false praise, yet it carried more weight than every insult she had endured. Her throat tightened, and she forced herself not to tremble, to stand straighter though her body begged to collapse. She gave no answer, there was none needed. The general's eyes lingered on her a heartbeat longer before he turned sharply, barking orders to the others, rallying them to fortify the line before the next assault hit. The moment passed, swallowed by the demands of survival, but in her chest something new stirred, a quiet fire, steady and enduring. Yet even as respect began to stir among her comrades, there were those who could not accept what they had seen. She caught their looks, sharp and resentful, as though her defiance of weakness had exposed their own. One man muttered under his breath, calling her reckless, saying she had risked both their lives for nothing. Another scoffed that it had been luck, nothing more, that she would not survive another hour if the battlefield demanded the same again. She heard it all, the bitter edge of envy hiding beneath their words, but she no longer flinched. Their voices were powerless now. She had carried a man through hell, and they had watched it with their own eyes. No denial, no sneer, no poisoned word could strip that away. Night began to fall, the sky smeared with smoke that glowed red from distant fires. The battlefield quieted into uneasy silence, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the crackle of burning wreckage. She sat against the trench wall, her body trembling uncontrollably, unable to stop the shivers that racked her frame. Her arms throbbed, her back felt broken, but exhaustion was a welcome blanket after what she had endured. Around her, the men whispered, glancing at her as though she had become something otherworldly, a creature carved from defiance and stubbornness. She did not care for their whispers any longer. Her mind drifted back to that first step into the open, that first decision to rise when every voice screamed for her to stay down. It had been madness, perhaps. But in that madness she had found her truth. The man she had saved stirred nearby under the care of the medics. His face was pale, his eyes half-lidded, yet he kept glancing toward her. Once she caught his gaze, and for the first time since she had met him, there was no mockery there. No laughter, no smirk. Only something quiet, something she could not name. Gratitude, perhaps. Regret, perhaps. She looked away, unwilling to untangle it. She had not carried him for thanks, and she did not need his apology. Her strength had not been proven for him but for herself. Still, the look lingered in her mind as the night deepened, the sky darkening to ink above the ruined fields. As the cold crept in and silence settled heavier over the trench, she closed her eyes, her rifle across her lap, her breath slowing despite the ache in her chest. She knew the war was far from over. Tomorrow the guns would roar again, the ground would shake, and men would die screaming in the mud. Tomorrow they would test her again, doubt her again, perhaps even try to drag her back into the shadow of weakness they had caged her in. But tonight she had carved a place in their memory they could never erase. She had dragged a man through fire and fury when none believed she could, and the general himself had seen it. That truth was enough to steady her heart as sleep finally claimed her in the hollow silence of the trench. The morning came with a cold wind sweeping across the scarred earth, carrying the bitter stench of smoke and decay. She awoke stiff and sore, her body aching as though it had been beaten with iron rods, but she did not complain. Around her, the camp stirred with uneasy movement, men whispering in low tones, preparing for whatever came next. The memory of yesterday still clung to them, the image of her dragging a wounded soldier through hell burned into their minds. Some glanced at her with a newfound respect, nodding subtly when their eyes met, while others avoided her gaze entirely, unable to reconcile their past mockery with what they had witnessed. She rose slowly, her legs trembling but steady enough to hold her, and she strapped her rifle back across her chest. The war did not care for heroes or moments of triumph. The war only demanded more blood, and she knew that what she had done yesterday would mean nothing if she could not survive what was coming today. The general walked the line that morning, his sharp eyes inspecting every man and woman with the same cold precision as always. Yet when his gaze fell on her, he lingered. He did not speak, did not praise her again, but the flicker of acknowledgement in his stare was enough to remind everyone that he had seen her courage with his own eyes. That silent recognition carried more weight than any medal could. The men noticed, and though they whispered among themselves, none dared laugh at her now. She had crossed a line that separated words from proof, and proof could not be undone. Still, she felt the pressure of their expectations heavier than any wound. If she faltered today, if she failed in the next storm of battle, the whispers of weakness would return louder than ever. She had earned respect, but respect was fragile here, and the battlefield would test it without mercy. By mid-morning, the silence shattered once again with the first rumble of artillery. Explosions lit the horizon, the earth shook beneath their boots, and orders rang out like gunfire itself. The enemy was pushing hard, their numbers vast, their weapons relentless. She took her place on the firing line, crouched low, her rifle braced against her shoulder as the sky filled with smoke and dust. The first wave came screaming through the haze, and the trench roared back with bullets, the ground turning into a slaughterhouse in seconds. She fired until her arms ached, until her cheek bruised from the stock of the rifle, until the barrel smoked with heat. Around her, men shouted, some cheered, some screamed in pain as bullets found their marks. The world became chaos once more, a storm of sound and fury where time lost all meaning. Then the enemy broke through. A shell tore apart the trench wall just yards away, throwing men into the air like rag dolls, and suddenly the enemy surged through the breach. Close combat erupted, blades flashing, rifles turned into clubs, fists and boots slamming against flesh. She was thrown backward, mud filling her mouth as she scrambled to her knees. A figure loomed over her, rifle raised like a spear, and instinct alone saved her. She rolled aside, swung her own weapon upward and fired point blank. The man collapsed, his blood splattering across her face, but there was no time to think, no time to breathe. Another came, then another, and she fought with a ferocity born of sheer will, each movement powered not by strength of arms but by refusal to die. Her thin arms, once mocked, held her rifle steady, pushed back every strike, and when she drove her bayonet into the chest of another attacker, she felt the world slow, her body moving with grim precision. The general himself was on the line now, shouting commands, rallying the men as the enemy poured in like a tide. He saw her again, saw the girl fighting among giants, her movements wild yet unyielding, her body straining yet never faltering. She fought not as a soldier desperate to survive but as one determined to prove, every second, that she belonged. Her comrades, once doubters, now fought harder at her side, their fear tempered by the sight of her defiance. They had mocked her weakness, but in the crucible of battle she had become something else, something that could not be ignored. Together they pushed back inch by inch until the breach was sealed with bodies and fire, and the enemy retreat slowed beneath the relentless storm of resistance. When the gunfire finally lessened and the field grew quiet save for the groans of the dying, she collapsed against the trench wall, her chest heaving, her hands slick with blood, hers and others. She stared at them, trembling, barely able to believe what she had done, yet unwilling to let herself feel the horror of it. There was no room for horror here. Only survival. Around her, men staggered and slumped, staring at her with something close to awe. Some clapped her shoulder, their voices hoarse with exhaustion, muttering words like brave and unbreakable. Others said nothing, but their silence carried no mockery this time. It carried something heavier, respect they could no longer deny. The general moved among the wounded, offering orders for the medics, his presence steady as a stone in the chaos. When he passed her, he stopped for the briefest moment. Their eyes met, and though his face betrayed nothing, she saw the truth in his gaze. He did not see a girl with weak arms anymore. He saw a soldier. Without words, he gave her that recognition, then moved on, leaving her trembling with exhaustion yet burning with a fierce pride she had never known before. The war was far from over. The enemy would return, perhaps stronger, perhaps deadlier, but she had carved her place now. No one could erase what she had done, not yesterday, not today. She was no longer the weak one. She was the proof that strength was not in arms or size, but in will that refused to break. The days that followed bled into each other like endless nights, each sunrise promising nothing but more fire, more screams, more broken bodies scattered across the mud. She fought on, never asking for rest, never yielding, though her body was covered in bruises and her arms carried the constant throb of strain that refused to fade. The others watched her differently now. No longer did they laugh when she lifted her rifle or when she hauled supplies through the trenches. They no longer mocked the way her arms strained beneath the packs. Instead, they stepped aside, quiet as though something about her presence demanded space. Even those who still whispered resentment behind their teeth could not deny the proof of her survival. But with every battle, every bloody hour, she felt the weight of expectation grow heavier, as though now that she had proven herself, she was bound to live up to it again and again without faltering. The general summoned her one evening after the smoke had cleared and the dead had been carried away. His tent stood at the edge of camp, a dark silhouette against the dying glow of fires in the distance. She entered silently, mud still clinging to her boots, her uniform torn and stiff with dried blood. He sat at a wooden table, maps spread before him, his sharp eyes lifting to meet hers as she stepped inside. For a long moment he said nothing, only studied her, as if weighing every line of exhaustion in her face against the steel he had seen on the field. Finally he spoke, his voice even, steady, but carrying a weight that made her spine straighten. "You have fought with more courage than many men under my command. But courage alone is not enough. Do you understand that?" She nodded, unable to find words, her throat too tight. He leaned forward, his gaze unblinking. "The war will demand more of you than dragging a wounded man or standing your ground in a trench. It will demand you break and still rise. Do you believe you can do that?" She wanted to say yes, but the truth stuck like a stone in her chest. Still, she forced her voice to rise, hoarse and cracked. "I will." The general studied her longer, as though searching for weakness in her words. Then he gave a slight nod. "We'll see." He dismissed her without another word, but the encounter carved itself deep into her mind. She returned to her cot that night and lay staring at the canvas above her, her muscles aching, her heart pounding with questions she could not silence. Was her will enough? Could she endure what was still to come? Doubt whispered to her in the darkness, but every time she remembered the jeers, the sneers, the laughter of the past, her jaw tightened and she clung to her defiance like a weapon. She had not come this far to falter now. The next battle came sooner than anyone expected. Before dawn, the enemy struck again, their artillery lighting the sky with fire that shook the ground like thunder. The trenches erupted into chaos, men scrambling, rifles loading, shouts echoing through the smoke. She was among the first to rise, her body still raw from days of fighting but her mind sharpened by necessity. She moved without hesitation, taking position on the line, firing into the oncoming storm. Her rifle barked again and again, her thin arms braced against the recoil, each shot a defiance of death. The enemy advanced relentlessly, their shadows looming through the haze, and soon the line shook under their weight. She fought until her fingers bled, until her shoulders screamed, until every part of her begged to stop, but still she pressed on. Then the order came from the general himself, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Hold the flank. Don't let them break it." She realized, with a jolt, that he was looking at her when he gave the command. The others glanced at her, waiting, and for the first time she felt the strange gravity of leadership press against her. She nodded sharply, gripped her rifle, and ran toward the threatened flank, shouting for the men nearest to follow. Some hesitated, but when she charged into the smoke, they went with her, unwilling to let her stand alone. The ground was slick with blood, the trench wall shattered in places, the enemy pouring through like a black tide. She threw herself into the fight without fear, slamming her rifle into an enemy's chest, firing point blank, dragging another back with sheer force before driving her bayonet into his side. Her arms screamed with pain, but she no longer cared. She had become a vessel of willpower, her body merely the weapon. The men who fought beside her shouted with new energy, inspired not by orders from above but by the sight of someone refusing to yield against impossible odds. Together they pushed, every inch bought with blood and sweat, until the enemy faltered and the flank held. She stumbled back into the mud, chest heaving, her face streaked with blood and grime, and for a moment all she could do was stare at the bodies around her. The ones she had killed, the ones she had saved, the ones who would never rise again. Her legs trembled, her arms hung heavy, but she was still standing, and that alone felt like victory. When the fighting eased at last, the men who had followed her gathered nearby, their eyes filled with something that had not been there before. It was not just respect now. It was trust. They looked at her as if she had become more than just another soldier on the line, as if she were someone they could anchor themselves to in the storm. She did not know what to do with their stares, did not know if she was ready to carry the weight of their faith, but the general, watching from a distance, saw everything. He saw how they rallied to her, how they fought harder in her presence, how her defiance had transformed into a force that pulled others with her. He said nothing, but his silence was louder than any praise, and she knew that he had marked her for something greater than survival alone. The night after the battle was restless, filled with the distant groans of the wounded and the low murmurs of exhausted soldiers trying to hold their minds together after another day of blood. She sat alone near the dim light of a dying fire, her rifle across her knees, her body trembling not from fear but from the violent exhaustion that never seemed to end. Her arms ached, her back throbbed, and her hands were blistered raw, but she forced herself to stay awake, her eyes fixed on the shadows beyond the camp. Sleep felt dangerous, as though the moment she closed her eyes the enemy would return, or worse, her doubts would consume her. Around her, men shifted uneasily in their sleep, some waking with sudden shouts from nightmares they could not escape. She envied none of them. The war lived inside them all, and there was no waking from it. The general appeared from the darkness, his boots crunching softly on the dirt, his presence so commanding that even the fire seemed to burn brighter in his shadow. He stopped a few feet from her, his sharp eyes studying her as though she were a puzzle that refused to reveal its secret. For a long while neither spoke. Finally, his voice cut through the silence, calm but edged with steel. "You held the flank today. I gave you no reinforcements, no orders beyond a single command. And still the line held." She swallowed, unsure if he meant to praise her or test her. He stepped closer, his face hardened by the weight of command, but his gaze unflinching. "Do you know why I watched you? Why I gave you that burden?" She shook her head, her throat dry. His lips pressed into a thin line. "Because I needed to know if what I saw in you was real. Weak arms don't matter. What matters is the fire behind them. Today you proved it's there." His words struck her deeper than any praise ever could. For a moment she wanted to thank him, to admit how close she had come to breaking, but she held her tongue. The general did not want gratitude, he wanted endurance. He crouched slightly, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Do not mistake this for victory. Respect is harder to keep than it is to earn. The men look to you now. Whether you want it or not, they see something in you that they are willing to follow. If you fail them, if you falter, it will crush them as much as it will destroy you. Do you understand?" She nodded slowly, her chest heavy with the weight of his words. She had fought to survive, fought to prove she was not weak, but now the fight was no longer just hers. She had become something larger, and the responsibility terrified her. The following days were filled with relentless drills, patrols, and sudden clashes with the enemy, each one testing her limits further. The general did not coddle her or shield her from the worst of it. If anything, he pushed her harder, assigning her to tasks that forced her to lead small groups of soldiers into dangerous positions. At first, she stumbled, her voice catching when she gave commands, her confidence trembling under the weight of responsibility. But with each mission, with each narrow survival, her voice grew steadier, her movements sharper, and the men began to obey her without hesitation. She had no rank, no stripes on her uniform, but something far stronger bound them, proof born in the mud and blood that she would never abandon them. One mission nearly ended in disaster. The general had sent her squad to scout a ruined village that intelligence suggested was abandoned. It wasn't. Enemy fighters lay in wait among the shattered walls, and the moment her group stepped into the open square, gunfire erupted from every corner. Men fell screaming, the air filled with bullets and dust, and panic threatened to unravel the line. She felt fear claw at her throat, but she crushed it down and forced her voice to rise above the chaos. Get to cover. Left flank, fire. Her commands cut through the storm and the men obeyed, moving with desperation but also with trust. She fired until her rifle clicked empty, reloaded with trembling hands and kept firing. By sheer will, by sheer refusal to die, she led them through the ambush, dragging the wounded herself when no one else could. They returned battered, bloodied, but alive, and when they staggered back into camp, the men whispered her name with reverence instead of mockery. The general saw everything. He never smiled, never softened, but his eyes told her enough when they lingered on her longer than anyone else. He tested her again, and each time she met the test, not with ease, but with grit carved from every ounce of her being. At night, when the camp was quiet, she sometimes lay awake wondering how much longer she could keep pushing, how much longer before her body gave out. But every morning she rose again because the memory of their laughter still burned like fire in her chest, and she knew that to stop now would be to let that laughter return. She would rather die than give them that satisfaction. One evening, after another long day of drills and skirmishes, she sat alone cleaning her rifle. Her hands shook with fatigue, her muscles screaming for rest, but her mind was locked in focus. The general approached once more, his steps deliberate, his gaze steady. He spoke in that same calm, commanding voice. You've grown. The men no longer call you weak. Now they wait for you to act before they do. That kind of power is rare and dangerous. She glanced up at him, unsure what he meant. His expression was unreadable as he continued. If you want to survive this war, you must carry that weight without letting it crush you. Leadership is not about strength of arms. It's about strength of will. You've shown you have it. Don't lose it. His words etched themselves deep inside her, both a warning and a promise. She looked down at her rifle, her reflection dim in the steel, and realized that she was no longer the girl who had been mocked for her weakness. The battlefield had stripped that version of her away and forged something new in its place, something that terrified her as much as it empowered her. And though the war raged on without end, she knew now that she was not just fighting for survival. She was fighting to prove that even in the darkest of storms, a single will could burn brighter than all the fires around it. The mission was whispered about in the camp long before orders were made official, a dangerous gamble that even seasoned soldiers spoke of with unease. Intelligence reported that the enemy had fortified a ridge overlooking the valley, a position so strong that every supply line feeding the front was threatened. If the ridge wasn't taken, their forces would starve, cut off, and crushed. To seize it meant climbing through exposed ground under relentless fire, a task most called suicidal. When the general gathered the unit, his face was harder than stone, his voice leaving no room for hesitation. We attack at dawn. Failure is not an option. The silence that followed was thick with dread. Eyes shifted toward her, not with mockery now, but with a silent question. Would she stand with them? Would she lead them through hell again? She met their gazes and gave a single nod, her jaw clenched so tight it ached. That night she did not sleep. The camp was restless, haunted by the knowledge of what awaited them, but her mind was sharper than fear. She sat sharpening her bayonet, her fingers steady despite the storm inside her. Doubt whispered cruelly, what if she failed them? What if tomorrow the men who trusted her would lie broken in the mud because of her choices? She pressed the steel against the whetstone harder, drowning the thoughts in rhythm. She had no luxury for fear. The men would see it and it would poison them. She had become their anchor. If she sank, they would all drown. By the time the first gray light crept across the horizon, her weapon gleamed, and so did the resolve burning in her eyes. The assault began with thunder. Artillery roared, the ground shaking as the first wave surged forward, rifles blazing. She led her squad from the front, her voice cutting through the chaos, urging them onward as bullets tore the earth around them. Men fell screaming, the air filled with smoke and dust, but she never slowed, never hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to dive for cover, but she forced herself forward, dragging others with her by the sheer force of will. When one of her men froze under fire, she seized him by the collar and pulled him forward, her eyes blazing with fury. Move. We don't stop here. Her words jolted him awake, and together they pushed on, scrambling up the torn hillside. The ridge was a nightmare of fire and death. Enemy machine guns cut through the lines like scythes, mowing down anyone who dared rise above cover. She hit the ground hard, mud spraying, bullets snapping inches overhead. Her heart hammered so violently she thought her ribs might crack, but she forced her head up, scanning for a path. To stay pinned meant certain death. She gestured sharply, signaling her squad to flank right, crawling on elbows and knees through the mud, her arms burning with every movement. Explosions showered them with dirt, the screams of dying men filling the air like a haunting chorus, but they pressed on inch by inch until they reached the jagged rocks shielding the base of the ridge. She knew they couldn't climb without covering fire. Gritting her teeth, she rose just enough to fire blindly into the enemy positions, each shot a desperate attempt to give her men a chance. Her shoulder ached violently, her arms numb from recoil, but she refused to let go. Her squad surged upward, climbing the rocks, and she followed, lungs burning, muscles screaming. Halfway up, one of her men was struck, collapsing with a cry that cut through the storm. Without thinking, she slung her rifle across her back and seized him, dragging his body up the slope, every inch a battle against gravity and exhaustion. Bullets tore the stone around her, but she shielded him with her own body, climbing until at last they reached the crest. The top of the ridge was chaos. Smoke, blood, and the roar of close combat filled the air as soldiers clashed hand to hand, rifles fired point blank, bayonets flashing in desperate arcs. She threw herself into the melee, her rifle but smashing into an enemy's jaw, her bayonet plunging into another's chest. Her arms felt like lead, every movement a scream of agony, but adrenaline drove her forward. She fought like a storm, reckless and relentless, her cries mingling with those of her men as they carved their way through the defenders. The ridge shook with violence, every heartbeat a coin flip between life and death. Through the haze, she saw the enemy machine gun nest still spitting death down the slope, mowing down reinforcements trying to climb. Her mind sharpened with brutal clarity. If it wasn't destroyed, the assault would fail and everyone would die. Without hesitation, she charged, her boots slipping on blood-soaked stone, her breath ragged but determined. She sprinted through the gunfire, bayonet ready, her scream ripping through her throat as she slammed into the nest. The gunner turned too late. She drove her blade into him with raw force, tearing him from the weapon. Another lunged at her, but she twisted, firing point blank, the blast tearing through the smoke. Her arms burned with fury, her body drenched in blood that was not all her own, but she refused to stop until the nest was silenced. When the gun fell silent, a cheer rose behind her. Her men surged forward, emboldened by her defiance, pressing the attack with renewed fury. The enemy line wavered, cracked, and finally shattered, retreating in chaos as the ridge fell into their hands. She collapsed to her knees, gasping, her vision blurred by exhaustion and pain. Around her, the men shouted in victory, their faces streaked with blood and grime, their eyes blazing with triumph. They looked at her not as a comrade, not even as a leader, but as the reason they were still alive. She tried to rise, but her legs trembled beneath her, and only when two soldiers rushed to help her stand did she realize how close she had come to breaking. At the rear, the general watched it all unfold. His expression did not change, but his eyes followed her as she staggered down the ridge, leaning on the men she had saved. He had given the order knowing most would not return, yet she had turned the impossible into reality. She had not only survived, she had carried others with her, reshaping the battle by sheer defiance. For the first time he felt the faintest flicker of something almost like pride. She had been mocked for weakness, dismissed as a liability, yet now, covered in blood and dust, she had become the unyielding fire his army needed. The ridge was theirs, but victory tasted like iron and ash. The valley below was littered with bodies, friend and foe alike, the earth soaked in blood that would stain it for generations. She stood at the edge, her chest heaving, her uniform torn and crusted with mud, her arms trembling as though every nerve inside her had finally given out. Around her, the men began the grim work of gathering the wounded, calling out names into the smoke-filled air, voices breaking when no answer came. She wanted to help, to throw herself into the work as she always did, but her legs quivered beneath her, and for the first time she admitted to herself that she had nothing left to give. Still, she stayed on her feet, unwilling to collapse where others could see. Weakness was not an option, not anymore. The general arrived hours later, walking with the measured calm of a man who carried wars in his veins. His uniform was spotless compared to theirs, but his eyes bore the same weight of loss, the same unyielding fire. He approached slowly, watching her as she stood alone, her silhouette stark against the fading sky. She straightened as best she could, forcing her shoulders back despite the ache tearing through her muscles. He stopped before her, his gaze piercing, and for a long while neither spoke. Finally, his voice broke the silence, deep and steady. "You led them up that ridge. You silenced the guns. Without you, this valley would be our grave." His words were not shouted, not adorned with ceremony, but spoken with the simplicity of truth. She wanted to deny it, to say she had only done what anyone else would, but she could not bring herself to speak. The weight of what had happened pressed too heavily on her chest. The general's eyes lingered on her battered arms, on the blood caked to her skin, the blisters torn open from dragging men across stone and mud. He had seen soldiers with muscles like iron fall in fear, and he had seen this woman with her so-called weak arms defy death again and again, carrying not only her own survival but the lives of those who followed her. His voice softened, though his tone carried its usual command. They mocked you once. Do you hear them now? She looked around at the men gathering in small groups, their faces lit by flickering fires, their voices low but filled with a reverence that could not be mistaken. Some glanced toward her, nodding silently as though acknowledging something they could not put into words. She swallowed hard, her throat tight. No, sir, she whispered, her voice raw. That night, as the fires dimmed and the men finally collapsed into uneasy rest, she remained awake, her thoughts drifting through the chaos of the past days. Every step of her journey replayed in her mind, the laughter of those who had called her weak, the sting of their words, the first wounded man she had dragged through miles of mud while her arms screamed with pain, the endless battles where she refused to fall. She realized now that the strength she carried had never been in her arms at all. It was in the refusal to stop, in the will that kept pushing when her body begged her to give in. The general had seen it from the beginning, though she had not understood why he pushed her so relentlessly. Now she did. He had been sharpening her like a blade, and tonight, on that ridge, she had been tempered in fire. Dawn came cold and gray, the valley below cloaked in mist. The camp stirred slowly, men moving like shadows through the fog, but wherever she walked, eyes followed her. They did not cheer, did not shout her name, but in their silence was something stronger, trust. A bond forged not by orders but by shared survival. Some of them approached her with simple words, thanking her not as a superior, but as someone who had stood between them and death. She listened, nodding quietly, her heart heavy with the realization that she had become more than she ever imagined. She had wanted only to prove she was not weak, but in proving it, she had become the anchor holding them together. Later that morning, the general summoned her to his tent. Inside, maps sprawled across the table, markers showing the ever-shifting lines of a war that seemed endless. He stood with his back to her, hands clasped behind him, his posture as rigid as ever. Without turning, he spoke. I have commanded men who had every advantage, strength, training, bloodlines. Most of them broke when the war demanded more than their bodies could give. But you carried a man for miles when they said your arms couldn't lift a rifle. You stood against fire that should have ended you, and still you dragged others forward. That is strength no enemy can take from you. He turned then, his eyes locking on hers, the faintest trace of respect softening his hard features. From this day you are not just another soldier. You are the standard they will measure themselves against. Do not forget that. She stood frozen, her chest tightening with the weight of his words. She had not sought honor, had not asked for recognition, yet it had found her nonetheless. The memory of those early days returned to her, the jeers, the smirks, the whispered doubts behind her back. All of it felt distant now, as though it belonged to someone else, a ghost of the woman she once was. She realized she had surpassed the need to silence their laughter. She had silenced it forever, not by proving them wrong, but by becoming something greater than their doubt. She bowed her head slightly, her voice steady for the first time. I won't fail them, sir. The general studied her a moment longer, then gave a single nod, a gesture small but carrying more weight than medals or parades. See that you don't, he said simply before turning back to the maps. She left the tent, stepping into the cool morning air, her breath visible in the mist. The battlefield still loomed and the war was far from over, but she walked with a new steadiness, her body broken but her spirit unyielding. The men rose as she passed, some offering weary salutes, others simply straightening their backs in silent recognition. She no longer needed their approval. She no longer needed to prove her worth. She had become a soldier not through strength of arms, but through strength of will, and that truth burned brighter than the fire of battle. The weak arms they once mocked had carried more than rifles, more than wounded men, they had carried hope, through mud and blood and fire. And as long as she drew breath, she would carry it still, for herself, for them, and for the war that demanded everything. The end.